Bandwagon. Also known as peer pressure. Description of bandwagon. The bandwagon is a fallacy in which a threat of rejection by one's peers, or peer pressure, is substituted for evidence. In an argument, this line of reasoning has the following form. Person P is pressured by his/her peers or threatened with rejection. Therefore person P's claim X is false. This line of reasoning is fallacious because peer pressure and threat of rejection do not constitute evidence for rejecting a claim. This is especially clear in the following example. Joe, Bill, I know you think that 1 + 1 = 2. But we don't accept that sort of thing in our group. Bill, I was just joking. Of course I don't believe that. It is clear that the pressure from Bill's group has no bearing on the truth of the claim that 1 + 1 = 2. It should be noted that loyalty to a group and the need to belong can give people very strong reasons to conform to the views and positions of those groups. Further, from a practical standpoint, we must often compromise our beliefs in order to belong to groups. However, this feeling of loyalty or the need to belong simply do not constitute evidence for a claim. Examples of bandwagon. Bill says that he likes the idea that people should work for their welfare when they can. His friends laugh at him, accuse him of fascist leanings, and threaten to ostracize him from their group. He decides to recant and abandon his position to avoid rejection. Bill, I like classical music and I think it is of higher quality than most modern music. Jill, that stuff is for old people. Dave, yeah, only real wussies listen to that crap. Besides, Anthrax rules. It rules. Bill, well, I don't really like it that much. Anthrax is much better. Bill thinks that welfare is needed in some cases. His friends in the Young Republicans taunt him every time he makes his views known. He accepts their views in order to avoid rejection. Fallacy. Begging the question. Also known as circular reasoning, reasoning in a circle, petitio principii. Description of begging the question. Begging the question is a fallacy in which the premises include the claim that the conclusion is true or, directly or indirectly, assume that the conclusion is true. This sort of reasoning typically has the following form. Premises in which the truth of the conclusion is claimed or the truth of the conclusion is assumed, either directly or indirectly. Claim C, the conclusion, is true. This sort of reasoning is fallacious because simply assuming that the conclusion is true, directly or indirectly, in the premises does not constitute evidence for that conclusion. Obviously, simply assuming a claim is true does not serve as evidence for that claim. This is especially clear in particularly blatant cases. X is true. The evidence for this claim is that X is true. Some cases of question begging are fairly blatant, while others can be extremely subtle. Examples of begging the question. Bill, God must exist. Jill, how do you know? Bill, because the Bible says so. Jill, why should I believe the Bible? Bill, because the Bible was written by God. If such actions were not illegal, then they would not be prohibited by the law. The belief in God is universal. After all, everyone believes in God. Interviewer, your resume looks impressive but I need another reference. Bill, Jill can give me a good reference. Interviewer, good. But how do I know that Jill is trustworthy? Bill, certainly. I can vouch for her. Fallacy, biased sample. Also known as biased statistics, loaded sample, prejudiced statistics, prejudiced sample, loaded statistics, biased induction, biased generalization. Description of biased sample. This fallacy is committed when a person draws a conclusion about a population based on a sample that is biased or prejudiced in some manner. It has the following form. Sample S, which is biased, is taken from population P. Conclusion C is drawn about population P based on S. The person committing the fallacy is misusing the following type of reasoning, which is known variously as inductive generalization, and statistical generalization. X% of all observed A's are BS. Therefore X% of all A's are BS. The fallacy is committed when the sample of A's is likely to be biased in some manner. A sample is biased or loaded when the method used to take the sample is likely to result in a sample that does not adequately represent the population from which it is drawn. Biased samples are generally not very reliable. As a blatant case, imagine that a person is taking a sample from a truckload of small colored balls, some of which are metal and some of which are plastic. If he used a magnet to select his sample, then his sample would include a disproportionate number of metal balls. After all, the sample will probably be made up entirely of the metal balls. In this case, any conclusions he might draw about the whole population of balls would be unreliable since he would have few or no plastic balls in the sample. The general idea is that biased samples are less likely to contain numbers proportional to the whole population. For example, if a person wants to find out what most Americans thought about gun control, a poll taken at an NRA meeting would be a biased sample. Since the biased sample fallacy is committed when the sample, the observed instances, is biased or loaded, it is important to have samples that are not biased, making a generalization. The best way to do this is to take samples in ways that avoid bias. There are, in general, 3 types of samples that are aimed at avoiding bias. The general idea is that these methods, when used properly, will result in a sample that matches the whole population fairly closely. The 3 types of samples are as follows. Random sample, this is a sample that is taken in such a way that nothing but chance determines which members of the population are selected for the sample. Ideally, any individual member of the population has the same chance as being selected as any other. This type of sample avoids being biased because a biased sample is one that is taken in such a way that some members of the population have a significantly greater chance of being selected for the sample than other members. Unfortunately, creating an ideal random sample is often very difficult. Stratified sample, this is a sample that is taken by using the following steps. 1. The relevant strata, population subgroups, are identified. 2. The number of members in each stratum is determined, and 3. A random sample is taken from each stratum in exact proportion to its size. This method is obviously most useful when dealing with stratified populations. For example, a person's income often influences how she votes, so when conducting a presidential poll it would be a good idea to take a stratified sample using economic classes as the basis for determining the strata. This method avoids loaded samples by, ideally, ensuring that each stratum of the population is adequately represented. Time-lapse sample, this type of sample is taken by taking a stratified or random sample and then taking at least one more sample with a significant lapse of time between them. After the 2 samples are taken, they can be compared for changes. This method of sample taking is very important when making predictions. A prediction based on only one sample is likely to be a hasty generalization, because the sample is likely to be too small to cover past, present and future populations, or a biased sample, because the sample will only include instances from one time period. People often commit biased sample because of bias or prejudice. For example, a person might intentionally or unintentionally seek out people or events that support his bias. As an example, a person who is pushing a particular scientific theory might tend to gather samples that are biased in favor of that theory. People also commonly commit this fallacy because of laziness or sloppiness. It is very easy to simply take a sample from what happens to be easily available rather than taking the time and effort to generate an adequate sample and draw a justified conclusion. It is important to keep in mind that bias is relative to the purpose of the sample. For example, if Bill wanted to know what NRA members thought about a gun control law, then taking a sample at an NRA meeting would not be biased. However, if Bill wanted to determine what Americans in general thought about the law, then a sample taken at an NRA meeting would be biased. Examples of biased sample. Bill is assigned by his editor to determine what most Americans think about a new law that will place a federal tax on all modems and computers purchased. The revenues from the tax will be used to enforce new online decency laws. Bill, being technically inclined, decides to use an email poll. In his poll, 95% of those surveyed opposed the tax. Bill was quite surprised when 65% of all Americans voted for the taxes. The United Pacifists of America decide to run a poll to determine what Americans think about guns and gun control. Jane is assigned the task of setting up the study. To save mailing costs, she includes the survey form in the group's newsletter mailing. She is very pleased to find out that 95% of those surveyed favor gun control laws, and she tells her friends that the vast majority of Americans favor gun control laws. Large-scale polls were taken in Florida, California, and Maine, and it was found that an average of 55% of those polled spent at least 14 days a year near the ocean. So, it can be safely concluded that 55% of all Americans spend at least 14 days near the ocean each year. Fallacy, burden of proof.